Well, okay, crafters, we've been having a ball here. I have, at least, putting lots of stitches on these hoops. We have already done 5 videos in this hand embroidery series. I have 2 more to go. So the next video that I'm going to do right now is the traveling stitches. Now, I've never seen anybody call these stitches traveling stitches. I named them that because they're decorative stitches that continue. They travel. So I'm going to show you a few that are just classic and used quite frequently, and I'm going to set the rest of this aside. But we have already done inline stitches, crossed over stitches, and knots, as well as a series on blanket stitches and satin stitches. So if you're looking for any of those, go check out the other videos. And I hope that I've given nice clear directions on these. So we'll go ahead now and do our traveling stitches. On this particular stitch, I marked out some lines to follow just to give me some guidelines, and I used my Cricut washable fabric pen for that task. So that's come in real handy. I'm using DMC floss, and this particular color is color number 350. And then I've been using my shears just to cut the thread. So we're going to go ahead and get started now with a stitch that I think I actually included with my inline stitches. I'm going to do it again because I'm going to do a couple of variations on this, but we're going to do some chain stitches. So the basic chain stitch would start by coming up through your fabric from back to front. And I think that's just at the very base of our window there. Okay, so I'm really right here at the base of my hoop, and I decided I should zoom in for you so you can see that detail just a little bit better. So what I've done is I've taken my embroidery floss from back to front. To make a chain stitch, I'm going to now take my needle and go right back in where I just came from, either right in the same hole or right next to it. Make a small stitch, whatever size stitch you really want to have actually, and then wrap your thread around your needle from underneath and pull that up, and that will make your first chain link. Now you're going to come in right next to that stitch on the inside of your loop, come in and bring your needle up, wrap that thread around it. Now I know you saw me maybe change directions there, and I'll tell you why. I decided, because I've got my thread on this side, I'm going to bring my needle in on the left side going forward, and that way I can just continue to wrap from right to left. So I do pay attention to that, and I do try to maintain consistency while I'm doing that. So again, I'm bringing my needle down back where I started, inside of the loop, bring it up through your fabric, wrap your thread around that needle. We'll just do a couple more of these. Make sure you've got it down because we're going to do some variations on this. So I want to make sure you've got the basic chain down. Now, when you've done your last link in your chain, what you want to do is just catch the edge of that loop, because you have it just loose here, right? So come on the outside this time, not on the inside like you've been doing, but right over the top of it, and just anchor that down. And there you go. So the next stitch I want to show you is just going to be a variation of this chain stitch. It's called the cable chain stitch. So you're going to come up from back to front, and then you're going to take your needle and put one full wrap on it. Just one. So that means you go over and then all the way back. Then you're going to come in where you would put your cable stitch, make your stitch, wrap your needle, and pull that through. Now you're going to you've got your first chain on here and a little starting kind of little detail there. So now you're going to continue that. You're going to wrap your needle once, but instead of going inside your loop, you're going to go right above your loop. Go ahead and make that stitch, wrap your needle, and just pull that through. And what you end up with is this lovely link detail between your stitches. So you have your chain, and you have this link, and then you have your next chain. Again, you're going to wrap your needle once, come in just after your chain, make your stitch, wrap underneath your needle, and I like to bring this right up under that chain before I pull anything through. Pull everything through, and you get this lovely little link between your stitches. So as in many of the stitches, when you have an open loop here and you're inside of that loop, you need to come on just the other side of it and lock it down. So that is a cable chain stitch. Now we just went from our chain stitch to a slightly complicated version of the cable chain stitch. Now we're going to go on to a complicated version, which is a double chain stitch. So I'm just going to give us some camera room here, and we'll work right here at the top. So this one is interesting. What you're going to do is you have to have a little bit of a starter foundation. So you're going to make just a single stitch. Then you're going to come up with your needle about a stitch length away, and you're going to come back into that stitch, not into the fabric, but just the stitch, and then come back down. In essence, you're making a chain link. Now you're going to come one more stitch forward, and here's where it starts to get fun. You're going to bring this thread, your needle, back into that same beginner stitch, and just under the stitch, not into the fabric. You're going to bring that down and bring your needle back into the same hole, but you do not want to bring this down tight. You want to leave those loops here. Now you want to come up again, make a stitch. You'll tighten these down in just a second. Now, what you want to do is you want to come in here and go underneath your chain, that first one that you set in. So you want to go over the loop, under the chain, both sides of the chain, and over that loop. Now, before you tighten anything up, you actually want to come to the thread that's coming out of the fabric and tighten from there. You could pull on the side of your chain that you need to. You know, if it was this side that was looped first, then you would pull from the opposite side. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, but you tighten all that down. Now I've got a nice loose loop here still, and I'm going to come back in, go right in the same hole, and I'm going to leave that open. Make my stitch. I'm going to come inside the big loop under that chain and just that very front part, and I bring that around, but I don't want to tighten this up. I just want to pull up from where the fabric is. That should tighten down both sides. If it doesn't, then pull down on the side that you need to first, which would be the opposite of the first loop. And you just keep going, and that is a double chain stitch. So I'm going to show you what I mean by opposite. I'm going to go ahead and pick up that chain, and because I did this part of the chain second, it'll pull that first loop tight, which I do want to be I want that first side to be tight before the second side is tight, right? Then I can come back to my thread coming out of the fabric and tighten that other side. That just tightens everything down. Now to finish this one, oops, I didn't leave that open, did I? Let's make that loose again. Okay, to finish this one, the way I like to do it is so that I don't have this very long stretch. I like to go ahead and make one more stitch, but instead of making a full stitch length, I just come right up underneath the previous stitch. Not in the same hole, which hopefully I didn't. Just under it, pick up that stitch, alright, let's see if you can see where all these, so I have my large loop here, and I have this last loop. So I'm going to pull from this side first, then I'm going to pull up from the fabric. Now at the end here I can tighten that down, because all I want to do at the very end is just bring this last little stitch down right next to or same hole as the previous stitch. And that little complicated baby is a double chain stitch. Okay, so I've loaded up some more thread on the needle. This is just about out of it. It was a DMC floss number 995, a real pretty blue. And I'm going to show you how to do some feather stitches. So what I've got on here, and hopefully you can see this, I know it's a little faint, but I think it comes through. I have 5 lines going across. Now I'm going to work the regular feather stitch, which means I'm going to work with these first 4 lines. So what I want to do is, oh, and by the way, I'm going to start at the top and work my way down. So I'm going to start my embroidery floss at line number 2. I'm going to bring my floss up and over to line number 4. And before I completely tighten that stitch, I'm going to come up one length below on line 3 and bring that stitch up. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to shift directions, and I'm going to cross over to line number 1 at that same level, and before I pull that one all the way through, I'm going to come back up again on line 2 and 1 stitch length below. Now I'm going to continue going back in the other direction. So I go over 2 lengths and then up 1 stitch below that. Now I'll cross over at that same distance and the same level. And then I'm going to go, here's my level, I'm going to go 1 stitch length, whatever your stitch length is, you determine that, right? And then I just continue, and that is called the feather stitch. Now to end your feather stitch, just like most of the chain stitches or blanket stitches, you've picked up a loop here that is just loose. So you just need to make sure that you stay on the other side of that loop, bring your stitch right down next to the first one, the one that's coming up, and just anchor that stitch down. So this is a single feather stitch. Now the reason we have a 5th line here is so I can show you how to do a double feather stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and start the same way. I'm going to come up at line number 2. I'm going to cross over line 4. I'm going to go 1 stitch below and come up in between my loop. Now I'm going to do just what I did for the first one. I'm going to come over to line 1 at the same level. I'm going to drop 1 stitch down and grab that loop in the process. Now I'm going to go ahead and go back over to line number 4. So everything about what I've done so far is exactly the same as the first version of the feather stitch. And right here I'm going to make the change. Instead of going back the other direction to line 1, I'm going to go in the other direction to line 5. I'm going to drop 1 stitch below. Now I'm going to go back the other direction. So again, I stay even here. Come up 1 stitch below. Over 2 more. Come up 1 stitch below, catch my loop. And then I go back in the other direction. Now, as you can imagine, you could do triple feathers and quadruple feathers, and you could, go in a diagonal direction if you wanted to. As long as you get the principle of how the stitch works, then I think we're covered. So again, once you've made your stitch, you can just lock it in. Now the last thing I'm going to do is take that feather stitch and just show you how it looks when it's been decorated a little bit. On this last stitch, instead of anchoring it with a little stitch here, I went ahead and made a nice long stitch. Now I came up and I made a French knot on that first branch, and I'll do that again. So again, bring my needle up. I wrap it twice, bring it right down next to, but not in the same hole from where you came up. Pull that needle through and lock it in. And then I just jump to the other side. And I can just put French knots going all the way up and make them look like cute little buds. This is a nice little element to add to maybe a wreath or a flower spray, or it looks like a little sprig of something, or you can do different colors. So you could have a little brown stem, maybe with those pink, like the cherry blossoms or something. It'd be really pretty. Aren't those great? So cute. Okay, I've loaded up another thread on the needle. This is color number 444, and I'm going to make 2 more stitch types right here that are related to the feather and the chain stitch. So the first one I'm going to do is called a closed feather stitch. Now the reason I'm doing these 2 back to back is they are literally only 1 tiny difference apart. So I'm going to show you that difference. So you start by bringing your needle from back to front, and then you're going to take your needle and make a stitch that goes down at about a 45-degree angle. Now I say down because I'm working this direction. You could go right to left, left to right. You can do all of that. So I've got my stitch here. Now I'm going to come up and I'm going to capture that loop just because it's a feather stitch, right? So I'm capturing that loop like I would in a feather stitch. Now what I'm going to do is then I'm going to come right above that stitch, and I'm going to go ahead and bring my needle up. I'm going to wrap that thread around my needle so I can capture that loop again. This is called a closed feather stitch. So you've got your feather stitch here, but then this one's next to it and it's kind of closed in. So now I'm going to cross over and go right here just above that loop and make another stitch. and I'm going to wrap that yarn around it, make another feather stitch. And it's closed because it's sitting right on top of the previous stitch. And this side's going to angle up like this. These are all going to angle this way. So again, I come right above my stitch, bring my needle over, wrap it, capture that loop, and we'll just put a couple more on here. To me, this is one of those kind of fun, it could be used as a haphazard kind of stitch. So if you look, you can see these all run the direction running up this way, and these stitches all run a direction running up this way. But I did some little tiny variations in stitch length. Here's kind of a small one, kind of a longer one. So you could use this as a fairly haphazard pattern, but that is the closed feather stitch. So to finish it, just like all of these, you just capture the last loop and anchor it down. Now, this is interesting to me that they even have two different stitches, but let me show you the difference. It's very, very subtle. So we're going to come up here and start the closed chain stitch, and we're going to start it the exact same way. I came up on my right side, and I'm going to come down on my left, bring my needle up. Technically, this line should be right about in the middle of the entry and exit point of the needle. I'm going to wrap that needle and make my first chain. Now here's that huge difference, the whole thing that makes this a whole different stitch. Instead of bringing my needle right here above my stitch, I'm going to bring it down below my stitch. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense yet, but it will in just a second, I promise you. Let me give you some room to view this here. So bring my stitch up, wrap my needle. Okay, so now that I have two stitches on, this is going to make more sense. Because what I really am doing in essence is I'm coming inside of my loop, not outside, but inside. That's it. That's the big difference. And so that's what makes it a chain stitch. So I come inside my loop, bring my next stitch up, wrap that yarn around the needle, and grab that chain basically. Get that tightened properly. There we go. Okay, so I just come back on the other side, inside my loop. I do like the way that this triangulates. You can, if you're doing some kind of geometric looking work, this is a great stitch to use. So we're just going to come over here and do it again. Inside my loop, come up to the top there, wrap my needle so I can pick up my loop. There we go. Let's just put one final stitch on here. And again, anchor that last stitch down. And then if you look at the two, you can definitely see a difference. Because look how neat and tidy the closed chain looks versus the open feather. So, closed feather. So there is a difference. If you want something that's a little bit crazy and haphazard, that's great. And then if you want something kind of geometric looking, that's a really nice stitch. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do another group of stitches. I've got some green thread on here, color number 911. You would think that would be red or something for an emergency, right? But anyhow, green, beautiful green color. And you can see on here I've created one center line, and then I have two dotted lines. I know they're faint, but you should be able to see that. Hopefully you can. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create some fly stitches. So a fly stitch starts at one of the outside lines, and you come over to the other outside line, And like the feather stitch, you come in and pick up that loop on that center line. But unlike the feather stitch, you don't take it anywhere. You come in and you anchor that stitch, and if you want to have another similar stitch close by, it's detached. So now I'm going to go ahead and make a second fly stitch. And it's not connected at all. Now you can use this stitch. It's something you could actually use as a leaf stitch again. You could come right up underneath the previous stitch and come all the way over underneath it. And you could connect it at this point by just coming up in the same hole that you ended your previous stitch in. And anchor that stitch down. And it should lay below it. You should be able to see both stitches clearly. But this is a nice stitch to use when you need anything that's going to have a spine down it. Any kind of definition you want to make with a center line. So you could do that and have them nice and tucked up. It's just another option. Now you also can play with the foot of this fly stitch. So we'll start another fly stitch here. We're going to come up now, and our anchor stitch, instead of just being a little short anchor, is going to just be elongated a little bit. Now it just looks to me a little bit like a little bird's foot or something. So maybe you wanted to make some little bird's feet. Well, you could just put another one next to it, a little off to the side. And maybe it looks like a little bird's been running by. Leaving a little bit of footprints behind, you never know. So that is the fly stitch. There's a couple more things you can do with that fly stitch. Here, let me give our little birdie 4 feet, 4 steps here at least. Looks kind of strange with only 3, just for some reason, I don't know why. Okay, anyways, that's fun. Make little bird feet out of it. You can attach. Even though it's a detached stitch, you could attach it. Now, we did attach it here. Let me bring my needle up so I can point at it properly. I didn't have enough thread for that. So we have it, you know, this is somewhat attached. They're lying side by side, but you can also make your elongated foot. It's right about the top of that anchor. Just go ahead and make another fly stitch. And now we can connect it by coming into the base of that anchor. And then you can bring down a little bit of a longer foot, and you can connect that. It's a great stitch to use for things like an arrow effect, birdie footprints, as I already mentioned, seagulls flying off in the distance, any kind of little accent bit that you want to add to something. So you have a way to have it disconnected or connected. if you wanted to finish this stitch, what I would do is I have these long anchors, and I would just finish that last stitch with another short anchor. And therefore you have a nice little stitch there. Now that could be also the base of a flower. You put a little flower right in here. So there's a lot of things you can do with that fly stitch. So that's another good one to have in your back pocket. Okay, I've loaded up a little more thread on that needle. This is color number 718, and I've got just a couple more stitches to show you. I have the scroll stitch that I wanted to show you. I'm just going to use this little bit of length right here. So let's make sure you can see that all on camera. What I'm going to do to start a scroll stitch is bring my needle from back to front. Now I'm going to work directionally up. So what I want to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to, well, there's two ways you can do this actually. One is to make a little loop here on my, with my thread, and then come in and take a little bit of that line and just bring this through. Now what happens is I get this cute little scroll, and the thread tends to have a little up and then a scroll. Now that's one way to do it, by creating that loop, but I think there's an easier way. Now I want to show you, my line is going in this direction. My needle is always going to come in here at a 45-degree angle and just cross my line and pick up the tiniest little bit of that thread. What I can do instead of laying that loop out on my fabric is, once I have my stitch in place, I can pick up that working thread, and that's the thread coming out of the previous knot or swirl or scroll. I can pick that up, go under my needle on the back side and on the front side, and wrap it, and then I can do that same stitch. And what you should see when you're done, you should see this nice scrolled effect. So tension on this one's important. Don't pull it too tight because you'll lose the effect. So we'll go ahead and make another stitch. So I'm making my stitch go across my line. I'm taking that working yarn coming from the previous stitch, bringing it under the back of my needle and all the way around and under, whoops, and under the front of my needle. So you can see that loop there, it's just that it's already in place. And then I pull my needle through, making sure I get that cute little scroll, and that I don't pull it too tight. And then we go again. So cross your stitch, take that working yarn, bring it under your needle in the back and in the front, or the top and the bottom, or the bottom and the top, whatever it may be. The eye and the point, maybe that would be the way to go. Pull that down, and you've got your nice, darling little scroll. Make sure you grab the right part of the thread. And there's your scroll stitch. Now to end this one, just like a lot of the stitches, you can just come on the other side of your last scroll and lock it in. Okay, now this last stitch, it's similar to the scroll stitch, and that's why I want to include it. It's called the Chinese knot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be making my knot along this line. And again, I'm working up, so you'd have to orient yourself for right to left or left to right. But what I'm going to do is, my knots are going to be along this line, but my stitch is going to begin from just below that line. So I'm going to come up, I say below, but really I'm to the left of my line. I bring my thread up. And the reason I say these two are similar is because with both of them you can lay down a loop on the fabric and then you sew into that loop. So in this case, I've got my stitch is going to come over up to here. My knot's going to lay on that line. So what I need to do is take my thread, I grab it on my finger, and I bring it towards me. And now, whoops, I'm sorry, did it backwards. I take my thread, I've got it coming up. I'm going to bring my finger up, pushing the thread away from me, and then I'm going to loop it back towards me. And when I do that, I'm going to lay that loop right on my line. So I've got my thread coming out of the fabric, coming over my line, and then the under part of that thread I've got right next to where the thread came up. Now I'm going to make my knot at an angle. So I came up here, my knot's going to be about there, so that's where my stitch is going to go. So I put my stitch in, I bring it back to that starting point where I started the other stitch. Now if you'll notice, I'm inside my loop, but only on the back side here, not on the front. I bring my needle through, catch my knot, and pull it through. And that is a Chinese knot. So I'm going to do that again. I'm going to take my thread, push it away from me, flip it over. Oh, I keep doing that wrong. Away from me, flip it over, lay that loop on my fabric. Come in with my needle at the proper angle, make my stitch. I only go through, that stitch is only sitting on the upper part, close to the eye part of the needle. There, that works so much better when you put that right on there. Okay, let's try that again and see if I can remember which way my hand needs to go exactly. So I've got my stitch coming up from off of my line. I'm taking the thread away from me, away and around. I'm going to bring that needle into the fabric. It really does go faster when you have it down. I have to think about it still, so it's not going very quickly. Bring my needle through. I can go ahead and tighten that down, which I think is easier. And then pull my needle all the way through. So I feel like in many ways it's similar to that scroll stitch because you can lay down the loop that you're going to work on in that stitch, and with this knot you can lay down that loop in your stitch. So let's try it again. Pushing away from me and looping. That's right. I did it right that time. Lay that loop down. Take your stitch. That's your knot's finish point, and this is the start of your next stitch. Go ahead and bring that loop down tighter and run the line through. And there we go. Now to finish this stitch, see, I didn't even have to think about it that time. Once you do a few, all of a sudden it becomes very easy to do. Alright, so let's go ahead and do our final stitch and show you how to tie it off. So basically you're going to make that loop again. And this time you'll go ahead and bring your stitch in, but you won't bring it back out. So go ahead and bring that loop tightened up on your needle and just bring it all the way through. And there you have it, the Chinese knot. So there's several stitches here, what I call the traveling stitches. And most of them are connected. You can have some disconnection. And this one I would say is slightly disconnected as well. But these are stitches that I consider to be pretty common stitches and stitches that can travel and have a little more detail than the inline stitches. So I wanted to separate them out. I hope that you've learned something. I hope you thought of maybe some ideas for using these. And I especially love the feather stitch with the little French knots. You know, the doodles and everything these days have the little twigs with little berries and flowers and little tiny leaves at the end. And I just think that that reminds me of the doodling that's happening right now that's kind of popular as well. So if you like what we've been doing, then please go ahead and subscribe to us and hit that little bell so you can get noticed when you get a new video out. And if you like what we're doing, hit the like button. We sure appreciate it. Thanks a bunch.